June 1863. The rolling plains of Kansas, a volatile frontier territory straddling the uneasy peace between the fledgling United States and the expanding Confederacy. As dawn broke, 40,000 Confederate soldiers advanced, their lines a perfect, menacing tableau. The earth thrummed with the thunder of their cavalry, the formidable horsemen of the South, known throughout the continent. Facing them were 25,000 Union soldiers. Many were raw recruits, their bayonets trembling in their hands. Did they comprehend the deadly threat bearing down on them? 40,000 against 25,000, seasoned Confederate warriors who had shattered entire armies against soldiers barely familiar with the basics of drill. General Beauregard, observing the Union ranks from his black charger, offered a grim smile. He'd seen this play out dozens of times, the Union sending another mediocre army to the slaughter. In a few hours, these plains would be awash in blue blood, and the fortress town of Fort Harker would fall. Then, nothing would stop the Confederate advance on the vital rail hub of Junction City. Yet, something was unusual on the battlefield. Before the Union lines stretched uneven, chaotic patterns of trenches, ditches, and earthen mounds, seemingly thrown up haphazardly. Beauregard frowned. The Union troops were digging like frightened moles, a sign of desperation, of weakness. But Beauregard had no inkling that each trench was dug with meticulous precision, positioned exactly where the Confederate cavalry intended to charge. Each mound concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes, ready to impale horses and riders. At the forefront of the Union army stood a 25-year-old man, calmly observing the Confederate advance. This was Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, the youngest commander in the Army of the Potomac. In the coming days, he would prove that battles were won not just with bayonets and cannons, but with picks, shovels, and, most importantly, intellect. Today, you will learn how 25,000 men overcame 40,000, how the very earth became the Union's deadliest weapon, and how engineering might crush brute force. If you wish to discover how a colonel transformed empty plains into a labyrinth of death, striking terror into the heart of the most powerful confederation in the East, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. What you are about to witness will change your perception of 19th century warfare. The Battle of the Plains of Desolation is about to begin. To grasp the magnitude of what transpired at Desolation, one must understand the world that birthed this conflict. 1863. The United States was not the unified nation Julius Caesar or George Washington had envisioned. The West had been largely settled, but the East was embroiled in a bitter civil war. The capital, Washington, D.C., was under constant threat, while the South, a confederation of states, harbored grand ambitions of their own. President Lincoln had ascended to power just 2 years prior. He was consumed by the idea of preserving the Union, of keeping the states united, of restoring the nation's ancient name, United States of America. On the frontier, and along the contested borders, the Union and the Confederacy were locked in an unending conflict. Two rival powers, sharing a contested line stretching for hundreds of miles. Two ideologies that despised each other with a generational passion. Unionists called Confederates rebels. Confederates called Unionists tyrants. The formidable Confederate cavalry, the gray ghosts of Stuart's command, were considered invincible. These were elite warriors, trained from childhood. Each rider wore a battle-tested uniform, wielded a saber, a Colt revolver, and a Spencer repeating rifle. One Confederate horseman in open battle was worth 10 Union infantrymen. Confederate tactics were brutal in their simplicity. Massive cavalry charges that broke enemy lines like a hammer shattering clay pottery. Mounted riflemen unleashed volleys from a safe distance. Elite infantry then finished what the cavalry began. For 2 years, this system had shattered armies from the Mississippi to the Appalachians. The Kansas campaign had begun in 1861. Border towns in Missouri and Kansas shifted their loyalties between North and South like fickle patrons. General Price, determined to end this indecision, invaded Kansas. Lincoln responded in kind. 4 years of skirmishes, sieges, small battles, thousands dead, and no decisive victor. Of course, the Union won some battles, the Confederacy others. Forts changed hands, towns were sacked. No decisive blow had been struck. Beauregard was aging. He understood he had to conclude this conflict before his time ran out. He needed a victory, so crushing it would bring the Union to its knees, begging for peace. In June 1863, Beauregard prepared his final gambit. He assembled 40,000 of his finest troops. These were not peasant militias, not forcibly conscripted recruits, but veterans who had decimated Union forces. 10,000 gray ghosts in full battle regalia, 15,000 mounted riflemen, 15,000 elite infantry, an army designed to break the Union's back in the West. His objective was Fort Harker. Fort Harker was not merely a town. It was a strategically vital fortification built specifically to guard the vital rail lines into Kansas. President Lincoln had authorized its construction in 1862, directly on the frontier, in violation of any semblance of a truce, imposing log and earthwork walls, watchtowers, and a constant garrison of 5,000 soldiers, with warehouses bursting with supplies, capable of withstanding months of siege. If Fort Harker fell, the path into Kansas would be open. If Kansas fell, the rich farmlands of the Midwest would be exposed. If the Midwest fell, the Union capital itself would be in grave danger. Lincoln understood this perfectly. His cabinet knew it. The merchants of St. Louis, too, realized this and trembled at the thought of Confederate hordes looting their warehouses. This was why Lincoln sent his finest strategist, a commander most at court considered too young, too inexperienced, and too ambitious. A commander by the name of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. Chamberlain was born around 1,838 inches, Maine, a state where frontier conflicts and maritime trade were part of everyday life. He was not from a senatorial family. He had not inherited military rank from his father. His family was modest, merely small farmers, nothing more. He joined the army, like any other young man without fortune, in search of glory and a steady paycheck. He was 15 years old when he enlisted, tall for his age, strong. But it was not his musculature that caught the attention of his superiors. It was his intellect. While other recruits learned basic formations through rote memorization, Chamberlain asked, why? Why this formation and not another? Why attack the center, not the flanks? Why attack now and not wait? His officers initially deemed him insolent. Then, they recognized his genius. Chamberlain possessed something most others lacked: a mind that saw battles as three-dimensional chess matches. While other generals learned tactics from textbooks written 50 years prior, he improvised. While others relied on brute force and the courage of their men, he studied the terrain, the weather, the psychology of the enemy, the weaknesses of every formation. He rose quickly through the ranks, too quickly for veteran generals who watched him with barely concealed contempt. At 18, he was already a captain. At 20, he commanded a cavalry troop of 500 men. At 22, 1,000. At 24, 5,000. His soldiers adored him because he won battles without sacrificing them unnecessarily. His peers envied him because he eclipsed their mediocre achievements. At 25, Lincoln appointed him colonel of the 20th Maine, commanding all Union forces on the Kansas frontier, the youngest colonel to achieve this rank in 2 decades. The corridors of power in Washington buzzed with whispers. A boy commanding Lincoln's armies against the Confederacy. Madness, cronyism, political favoritism. Senators protested. Veteran generals threatened to resign. Lincoln ignored them all. He saw in Chamberlain what others did not: pure genius, waiting to be unleashed on the battlefield. Lincoln was placing the fate of the western frontier on this young man with a keen gaze and an unshakable confidence. If Chamberlain failed, the Confederacy would conquer Kansas. If he succeeded, the Union would reclaim its lost prestige. Now, this young man stood before Fort Harker with the simplest, yet most impossible order: stop the Confederates. Chamberlain arrived at Fort Harker in May 1863 with 25,000 men. He surveyed his troops and saw the cold, hard truth. Perhaps 5,000 were seasoned veterans of past skirmishes, soldiers who knew war, who would not flee at the first sound of enemy bugles. The rest were raw recruits from Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, farmers, torn from their fields 3 months ago. They knew how to form a battle line. They knew how to hold a rifle, and that was all. There were mercenaries, some loyal Comanche riders, loyal only to the gold Lincoln paid them. His officers informed him that scouts had confirmed intelligence about the Confederate Army. 40,000 men under the command of Beauregard, a Confederate general with 30 years of experience crushing Union armies. The Confederate had commanded the invasion of Missouri in 1862. He had destroyed 3 Union armies in open battles. He was ruthless, experienced, and confident. The Confederate heavy cavalry was at full strength. 10,000 heavily armed riders would be ready to annihilate Union infantry, as they always had. The rest, elite infantry trained in the military academies of Richmond, and mounted riflemen capable of firing 20 shots a minute. Chamberlain's veteran generals advised him to retreat behind the walls of Fort Harker, await a siege, and request reinforcements from Washington. Lincoln could send another 10,000 men in 3 weeks, but retreat meant ceding the initiative. It meant allowing the Confederates to pillage nearby towns. It meant demonstrating weakness, and weakness provoked further invasions. On his first night at Fort Harker, he convened a war council. Officers gathered in the governor's hall, expecting orders to reinforce the walls, prepare boiling oil, strengthen the gates. A typical defensive strategy. Chamberlain unrolled a map of the plains before Fort Harker. He pointed to the open terrain stretching for several miles north of the town. Flat, open plains, ideal for cavalry charges. This was where the Confederates expected to meet the Union Army in open combat. This was where the Union would be annihilated by the numerical superiority of the Confederate heavy cavalry. Chamberlain then outlined his plan. They would not defend behind walls. They would venture onto the open ground. But the battle would not be as the Confederates expected. They were going to turn these plains into something no Confederate commander had ever encountered. They were going to turn flat earth into a labyrinth of death. The officers watched Chamberlain in silence. He pointed to the map with surgical precision. The plains before Fort Harker were approximately 3 miles wide. Absolutely flat terrain with no hills, forests, or rivers. Nothing to stop a Confederate cavalry charge. This was precisely the type of battlefield on which, for 2 years, the Confederacy had crushed armies. Chamberlain drew lines on the map with charcoal, 3 parallel lines, crossing the plains from one side to the other, designed to channel the movement of Confederate cavalry precisely where he wanted them. The Confederates would simply bypass the trenches and attack the flanks. Chamberlain smiled. Narrow at the edges, wide in the center. The Confederates would be forced to use the corridors he left open, and these corridors were designed for their annihilation. 1 meter in diameter, half a meter deep, covered with branches and earth to appear as solid ground. At the bottom, sharpened stakes, pointing upwards. When Confederate horses charged over them, their legs would break, the stakes would pierce their bellies, and riders would fall at full speed, breaking their necks. The cavalry would be divided into 2 wings, hidden behind artificial earthen mounds. When the Confederates entered the trenches, the cavalry would attack from the flanks. The Confederates would be trapped between infantry in front and cavalry on the sides, with no room to maneuver, no escape. General Grant, one of his most experienced generals, would be responsible for creating hundreds of pits and earthen ramparts. With 25,000 men working day and night, it would take at least 4 days. The Confederates would arrive in 5 days. According to scouts, time was running out. Chamberlain nodded. That was why they would start the next day at dawn. Everyone not on duty would dig, without exception. Officers, enlisted men, mercenaries. All had 4 days to turn these plains into a graveyard for the Confederate Army. The council adjourned. The officers departed, divided in their opinions. Some believed in the plan, others saw it as desperation disguised as genius. At dawn the next day, 25,000 men began digging. Chamberlain divided the work with military precision. Experienced infantrymen dug the main trenches. They knew the exact dimensions required. 2 meters deep, 1.5 meters wide, with walls at a 45-degree angle, making it difficult for horses to jump. Less experienced recruits dug the hidden pits. The work was simpler but equally grueling. Dig, place stakes, camouflage, repeat hundreds of times. Auxiliary troops and mercenaries constructed earthen ramparts on the flanks. They piled the excavated earth from the trenches, creating elevated positions for riflemen, earthen walls from which cavalry could suddenly emerge. The first day was organized chaos. 25,000 men moved across the plains. Pickaxes struck the hard earth. Chamberlain was everywhere. He inspected every trench, tested the depth with his own spear. If a trench was 15 centimeters shallower than required, he ordered it dug deeper. He dug with his own hands, getting dirty like any common soldier. This changed the atmosphere. If the general dug, they dug without complaint. Burning muscles, hands with open blisters, backs breaking from constant bending. The first trench was now complete. It stretched for 3 miles from one edge of the plains to the other. The second trench was halfway done. Between them, over 100 hidden pits had been strategically placed. Chamberlain explained to his officers the purpose of each element. The first trench would halt the initial Confederate attack. It would force them to slow down, to find crossing points. These crossing points would be at the edges of the trenches, guiding the Confederates towards the center, where more trenches and pits awaited them. The second trench was positioned precisely where the Confederates would attempt to regroup after overcoming the first. It would deny them time. The third trench was where they normally deployed their full battle order. They would not even have that opportunity. On the third day, the transformation was visible for miles. The plains were no longer flat. They resembled a field plowed by drunken giants. Uneven lines crisscrossed the terrain. Earthen ramparts rose on the flanks. A constant dust covered everything. Scouts brought news. The Confederate army was 2 days' march away, 40,000 men, advancing slowly. Beauregard was not in a hurry. He knew the Union couldn't escape. He would crush them when he was ready. Chamberlain used this to his advantage. While the Confederates advanced with overconfidence, riflemen were already occupying prepared positions on the hills. The fourth day was dedicated to fine-tuning. Chamberlain ordered the hidden pits to be more carefully camouflaged. Fresh branches, transplanted grass, topped with a layer of earth. From 10 meters away, the terrain had to look absolutely undisturbed. The Confederates must suspect nothing until their horses collapsed. He also positioned his troops. Experienced infantry would take positions behind the trenches, forming the first defensive line. The recruits would form the second and third lines. In case the veterans fell, the recruits had to hold their ground. Retreat meant the Confederates would cross the trenches, and the entire plan would collapse. Riflemen were positioned on the side hills with clear instructions. Their primary target: horses. A dead or wounded horse could stop up to 5 riders, creating chaos in the Confederate ranks. The Union cavalry, including 600 Comanche riders under Sunequa, hid behind the hills on both flanks. Their hour would come when the Confederates were trapped in the trenches. Then they would attack from the flanks. Spears would be aimed at men deprived of maneuverability. It would be a slaughter. On the eve of the anticipated battle, Chamberlain gathered his commanders. He explained the final, most dangerous part of the plan: a feigned retreat. When the Confederates attacked the left flank, that section of infantry would retreat, simulating a complete rout. The Confederates would believe the Union line had broken. They would eagerly surge forward, anticipating an easy victory. After that, the Comanche cavalry would strike from the rear. The Confederates would find themselves surrounded, caught between infantry in front, trenches on the sides, and cavalry behind. General Grant asked, "What if the Confederates don't fall for the trap? If Beauregard is more cautious than expected?" Chamberlain replied coldly, "To break 40,000 Confederates with brute force, they would likely all perish." That was why the trap had to work. The night before the battle, Chamberlain toured the camp, speaking with ordinary soldiers, asking their names and where they were from. Some were farmers from Ohio, others fishermen from Pennsylvania, blacksmiths, carpenters, ruined merchants, ordinary men facing extraordinary death. He told them that tomorrow they would make history, that their grandchildren would tell stories of how 25,000 Union soldiers defeated 40,000 Confederates. Some soldiers believed him. Others merely nodded politely, but all felt something different: respect. This 25-year-old colonel had dug alongside them, sweated alongside them. If he was destined to die tomorrow, he would die with them. The dawn of the 5th day arrived with a clear sky. From the walls of Fort Harker, observers saw dust on the horizon, a lot of dust. The Confederate army was approaching. Chamberlain ordered his troops to take their positions. 25,000 men were deployed according to plan. Infantry behind the trenches, riflemen on the hills, cavalry hidden on the flanks. All was ready. The plains that 5 days ago were open had now been transformed into a labyrinth of death. Every trench was measured, every hidden pit placed, every earthen mound built with a specific purpose. The Confederates would learn that Union earth not only defended but killed. Chamberlain mounted his black charger and rode to the front ranks. He looked to the north, where the dust was thickening. 40,000 Confederates were approaching, expecting an easy slaughter. They were about to receive something entirely different. The Battle of the Plains of Desolation was about to begin. June 1863. The Plains of Desolation were enveloped in an unnatural silence at dawn. No birds, no wind. Only the sound of 25,000 men breathing behind freshly dug trenches. The dust on the horizon coalesced into something tangible. First, Confederate banners appeared, unfurling crimson and gold fabrics. Then the cavalry, thousands of riders advancing in perfect formation. The ground began to tremble. This was not an earthquake. It was the weight of 40,000 warriors marching towards their doom. Beauregard led the Confederate army, astride a white stallion, 50 years old. 30 of them spent crushing the Shah's enemies. He had seen this hundreds of times. A weak Union army, expecting annihilation. Another victory for his ledger. Another Union territory to be plundered. He ordered a halt 500 yards from the Union lines. He needed to assess the battlefield. His experienced eyes quickly scanned the terrain. He immediately noticed the trenches. Beauregard smiled. Trenches were a classic sign of Union desperation. They were trying to compensate for numerical superiority with passive defense. It wouldn't work. It never worked against Confederate heavy cavalry. The Confederates had leaped over trenches before. They had bypassed fortifications. They had crushed entrenched armies from the Mississippi to Arkansas. He ordered them to form battle order. 40,000 men deployed onto the field. The heavy Confederate cavalry formed the center. 10,000 riders in full armor. 4-meter lances glinted in the sun. On the flanks, 15,000 mounted riflemen, and behind them, 15,000 elite infantry, waiting to finish what the cavalry began. Everything was going according to plan. The Confederates had deployed their main forces precisely where he anticipated, in the center of the battlefield, directly before his trench system. Perfect. He wheeled his horse and rode along the Union ranks. His soldiers saw him pass. Today, the Confederates would learn what it meant to face Union engineering. Every trench they dug, every hidden pit, every rampart they built. These were all weapons aimed at Confederate throats. Do not retreat. Do not flee. Hold your positions, and the trenches will do the rest. The Union soldiers responded with shouts. It was the uncertain cry of veterans. It was the nervous cry of men trying to convince themselves they would survive the next few hours. But it was enough. Chamberlain returned to his central position. Next to him, General Grant commanded the Central Infantry. To his left, General Pope. To his right, General McClellan. On the hidden flanks, Sonnequa and his Comanche were awaiting the signal. On the Confederate side, Beauregard completed his preparations. He ordered the drum roll to begin. The cavalrymen began their advance at a walk, 500 yards, 400, 300. The ground trembled more with every yard. The Confederate horses were enormous. Breeds specifically developed for war. Each weighed over 1,200 pounds with its rider and full armor. Nearly 800 multiplied by 1.1 million pounds of flesh. Metal and death advanced to 200 yards. Confederate riflemen drew their bows. Their arrows struck Union shields with the sound of hail on wood. Some Union soldiers fell with arrows in their necks, faces, arms. Screams began. Chamberlain ordered his riflemen to respond. Dozens of horses fell. Their riders flew forward. The heavy armor turned every fall into broken bones. 100 yards. The cavalrymen quickened their pace to a trot. Lances lowered, pointed forward. This was the formation that had annihilated armies for 2 centuries. Unstoppable steel, the point of the lance, 50 yards. The Confederate riders began to distinguish the details of the trenches. Some seemed deeper than usual, but it was already too late to stop. 10,000 riders at full speed could not stop in 50 yards. 30 yards. Confederate commanders shouted, "Orders to jump the trenches." The horses prepared, muscles tensing for the leap. 10 yards. The first line of cavalrymen reached the front trench, and hell began. Horses tried to jump, but the trench was too wide, 2 meters deep, 1.5 meters wide, with sloped walls. The first horses jumped and fell in the middle of the trench. Their legs broke, riders fell on top. The 100 pound armor crushed them. The horses behind could not stop. They crashed into the fallen. They piled up, more and more riders falling. The sound was deafening, metal on metal, breaking bones, screams of men, neighing of horses in agony. The cavalrymen on the edges of the line avoided the main trenches. They looked for the corridors Chamberlain had left open. They galloped through them, thinking they had found a way. Then, the horses stepped onto the hidden pits. The coverings of branches and earth gave way. The horses' legs sank. Sharpened stakes pierced their hooves, ankles, bellies. The horses fell forward. Riders flew out at full speed. They landed headfirst. The sound of breaking necks mingled with the screams. Union riflemen from the ramparts fired without stopping. Arrows rained down on the mass of Confederate riders trapped in the trenches. At that distance they could not miss. Every arrow found flesh. Horse or man, it mattered not. Both bled the same. Beauregard watched from behind with growing horror. His first charge had just broken against the Union trenches, like a wave against a rock. Thousands of his best riders were dead, wounded, or trapped. This had never happened before. Never. He ordered a second attack. Mounted riflemen attempted to cross the trenches in different places. They encountered the same hidden pits, the same stakes, the same death. The plains before the Union lines had turned into a slaughterhouse. Horses with broken legs tried to stand. Riders bled out on the ground, which turned into red mud. Union soldiers behind the trenches could hardly believe their eyes. The formidable Confederate army had been defeated without them having to throw a single spear. The trenches did exactly what Chamberlain had promised. They channeled, they trapped, they killed. Beauregard changed tactics. He ordered the Confederate infantry to advance. 15,000 men marched towards the trenches. They could cross them more easily than cavalry. They carried improvised ladders, wooden planks. They would attempt to create bridges over the ditches. They positioned themselves at the edge. As the Confederates tried to cross, Union spears met them. Those who managed to cross encountered the Union shield formation at its finest. They were repelled. The Confederates fell into the trenches they were trying to cross. The battle turned into an organized massacre. Confederates continued to try to cross. Union soldiers continued to kill them in the trenches. Bodies piled up so high that some Confederates used the corpses of their comrades as bridges. They walked on the dead to reach the Union soldiers. They died on the bodies of their fallen comrades. 2 hours of fighting, the sun high, the heat infernal, men fighting, covered in blood and sweat. Thirst drove them mad, but no one dared stop to drink. Stopping meant death. Beauregard was in despair. He had lost nearly 10,000 men, without even shaking the Union positions. He needed to change the tide of the battle. He ordered a massive assault on the Union left flank, sending 5,000 of his best cavalry into the fray. If he could break this flank, he could bypass the trenches and strike the Union from the rear. The Confederate cavalry surged towards the left flank, commanded by General Pope. It was a powerful, coordinated attack. The Union soldiers in this sector were under incredible pressure. Some began to retreat. The lines buckled. Chamberlain, seeing this, smiled. Everything was going exactly according to his plan. He ordered Pope to feign a retreat. Pope loudly gave orders. His units seemed to retreat in disarray. The formation was broken. They fled backward. The Confederates, seeing this, exploded with cries of victory. The Union line is broken. Full speed ahead. 5,000 Confederate horsemen galloped in pursuit of the retreating Union soldiers. The Confederates did not notice the trap. 600 Comanche with repeating bows. The Comanche were the best mounted archers in the world, surpassing even the Confederates. They shot at full gallop. Arrows flew from 30 yards. Hundreds of arrows. The Confederate attack slowed. Commanders tried to turn their cavalry to face the Comanche, but turning 5,000 riders at full gallop was as impossible as stopping an avalanche. And then, the Union infantry, who had feigned a retreat, turned and reformed their lines. The Confederates were trapped. Union infantry in front, Comanche cavalry on the flank, trenches blocking any retreat. Sonnequin ordered a full charge. The Comanche crashed into the Confederate flank with devastating force. They simply charged forward. Beauregard watched the catastrophe from his position. His elite cavalry was destroyed. His infantry was stuck in the trenches. In 4 hours, he had lost 15,000 men. Infantry, riflemen, a total assault. All or nothing. They attacked directly into the center. Chamberlain ordered his entire line to hold firm. The Confederates reached the trenches. Some managed to cross them, using mountains of corpses as bridges. Along the entire Union line, hand-to-hand combat erupted. This was the most dangerous moment. If the Confederates broke through the line here, the entire plan would collapse. Chamberlain mounted his horse and rode straight to the epicenter of the battle. He fought alongside his soldiers. His presence energized the Union troops. If the colonel fought on the front lines, they could not retreat. The Union line bent, but did not break. Veterans held their positions. Recruits, inspired by Chamberlain's example, fought like demons. They pushed back the Confederates, meter by meter. The Confederates began to tire. Chamberlain saw an opportunity. He ordered a general counteroffensive. 23,000 Union soldiers advanced simultaneously. The Confederate retreat turned into a rout. The rout turned into a panicked flight. Beauregard tried to stop the disorderly retreat. He gave orders. He executed fleeing soldiers. Nothing helped. The Confederate army collapsed in complete panic. 40,000 men turned into a crowd fleeing for their lives. Chamberlain ordered to limit the pursuit. He did not want his troops to scatter chasing enemies. But the Union cavalry and the Comanche pursued the Confederates for many miles. They cut down the stragglers. They captured the wounded. As the sun began to set, the battle ended. The Plains of Desolation were littered with the dead, most of them Confederates. News arrived gradually. 15,000 Confederates killed, wounded, or captured, too stunned by what they had just experienced. Slowly, it began to dawn on them. They had won. 25,000 had defeated 40,000. The impossible had happened. Chamberlain rode across the battlefield as dusk settled. He saw trenches full of Confederate corpses, hidden pits with dead horses on top. 15,000 Confederate bodies covered 3 miles. The smell was unbearable. Dried blood, entrails, bodies swollen by the heat. Chamberlain ordered the Union dead to be buried first. 5,000 men had fallen defending the Union. They deserved a dignified rest. Soldiers dug mass graves. There was no time for individual burials. Some soldiers wept for fallen comrades. Others were too numb to feel anything. Wounded Union soldiers filled every available building in Fort Harker. Around 3,000 men with severe wounds. Severed arms, shattered legs, open entrails. Field surgeons worked tirelessly, cauterizing wounds with red-hot iron, amputating gangrenous limbs, administering opium to those screaming too loudly. Many would die of infection in the coming days. 19th century medicine could not save them. The Confederate prisoners presented a different problem. Around 8,000 survived capture. Chamberlain ordered them gathered in a guarded camp outside Fort Harker. They were given water and hardtack. Nothing more. Resources were limited. Among the prisoners were Confederate aristocrats, high-ranking officers, cavalry officers from acclaimed memoirs. They were worth a king's ransom. Chamberlain ordered them separated. They would be sent to Washington, where Lincoln would decide their fate. Some would be exchanged for Union prisoners, others displayed in victory parades. The unluckiest would face the fate of slaves. The battlefield itself proved to be a gold mine. Tens of thousands of Confederate weapons were scattered everywhere. From curved blades of Damascus steel and lances with iron tips, to Confederate repeating rifles, superior to Union muskets, scale mail, chainmail, and ornate shields. Everything had its price. Chamberlain ordered a systematic collection of trophies. Every Confederate weapon collected increased the arsenal of the Union Army. The best examples were sent to the National Armory in Washington, and the rest were distributed among the soldiers. Warriors who had previously fought with old equipment now received Confederate swords. It was a form of poetic justice. The surviving horses were also captured. Around 2,000 ownerless Confederate animals roamed the plains. Union soldiers surrounded and captured them. Confederate war horses were considered the best in the world. Each was worth several months of a soldier's pay. Union officers were already calculating how much gold they could fetch by selling these animals. While the Union soldiers cleared the battlefield, messengers raced to Washington. Chamberlain sent 3 separate groups in case of ambush. To ensure delivery, all carried the same message. A complete victory at the Plains of Desolation. 40,000 Confederates defeated, 5,000 Union soldiers fallen. Chamberlain requested reinforcements to strengthen the frontier. Messengers raced day and night, changing horses at every post station. They covered 300 miles in 4 days and arrived in Washington, covered in dust, but bearing the best news the Union had heard in decades. Lincoln received the dispatch in the White House. He read the report 3 times, ensuring he understood correctly. 15,000 Confederates against 5,000 Union soldiers. A ratio of 3. 1. Unbelievable, but it had happened. The president immediately convened Congress, where he read the report aloud. The senators requested confirmation from other messengers. All 3 dispatches matched to the smallest detail. The victory was undeniable. Washington erupted in jubilation. The news spread through the city like wildfire. Merchants closed their shops and poured into the streets. Ordinary citizens cheered for victory. This victory had significance beyond a military triumph. For 50 years after its founding, the nation had been on the defensive, losing territory, retreating, surviving. Desolation had changed that. The Union could win. The Union could crush rival powers. The Union still had commanders worthy of ancient heroes, theatrical performances, horse races, public celebrations. The Union treasury paid for it all. It was worth every penny. The morale of the nation needed such a victory. However, at court, celebrations mingled with envy. Veteran generals who had doubted Chamberlain now felt humiliated. A 25-year-old young man had achieved what they had never managed, to decisively defeat the Confederacy. Some acknowledged his genius. Others, however, began to sow seeds of doubt. Of course, he was just lucky. Of course, the Confederates made mistakes. Of course, he couldn't repeat it. Lincoln ignored these whispers. He promoted Chamberlain, granted him additional honors and gold, and expanded his authority. The president knew who he was dealing with, a commander who won impossible battles, a weapon he could use for his dreams of reunification. Meanwhile, on the Confederate side, news reached the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. King Jefferson Davis received reports from the survivors. At first, he refused to believe them. 40,000 of his finest warriors, defeated by 25,000 Union soldiers. Impossible. It must be an exaggeration. But more and more reports arrived. All told the same story. Trenches, hidden pits, stakes, terrain turned into a deadly trap. The Gray Ghost cavalry, the pride of the Confederacy, found themselves trapped like animals in a slaughterhouse. Davis was consumed by rage. He ordered Beauregard executed for incompetence. Sent messengers reported that Beauregard had survived but fled to Arkansas in disgrace. The king sent assassins. Beauregard died a few weeks later, officially from fever. No one believed the official version. The Confederate court debated further action. Some nobles called for immediate revenge, for the gathering of a new army, for a renewed invasion, to wash away the shame. Others advocated for caution. If Chamberlain had defeated 40,000, he could defeat 60,000. They needed a new strategy. Davis was aging. He was 70 years old. He knew he didn't have long. He did not want to die leaving behind a defeat by the Union. He made the decision to wait, observe, and plan. The defeat at Desolation had fundamentally changed the Union-Confederate dynamic. For 2 years, the Confederacy had been the aggressor, the Union the defender. Now, the Confederates hesitated. Every Confederate commander planning an invasion remembered Desolation, remembered the trenches, remembered the 15,000 dead. Confederate confidence was shattered. Confederate generals began to study what had happened at Desolation. They interrogated survivors. They reconstructed the battle. They realized that Chamberlain had not won by magic. He had won through engineering, preparation, and clever use of the terrain. This led to changes in Confederate military doctrine. Generals now ordered more thorough reconnaissance before battles. Commanders went to the plains to inspect the surviving trenches. They meticulously measured their depth. They carefully studied the angles and made notes. Field engineering became a primary focus of military training. Now, legions devoted as much time to training and digging as to combat formations. Every soldier was required to know how to dig a good trench, build a hidden pit, create a defensive rampart. Shovels were now valued as much as rifles. How did he calculate these dimensions? How did he distribute the traps? How did he manage to coordinate? Chamberlain answered some letters, but left others unanswered, not wanting his methods to become too widely known, for even allies could turn into enemies. 2 years after the Battle of Desolation, in 1865, the Union and the Confederacy concluded a peace treaty, called the Perpetual Peace, which proved ironic, as it lasted only 8 years. However, its basis was the Battle of Desolation. The Confederacy agreed to terms favorable to the Union, fearing another defeat like Desolation. This treaty provided Lincoln with what he needed: a stable western border, allowing him to transfer troops from the west to the east. In 1866, Chamberlain led an invasion of Florida, crushing the secessionist forces. In 1868, he began a campaign in Texas, initiating the reconquest of the South. None of this would have happened without desolation. The battle granted time, brought peace, opened opportunities. In one day of fighting, Chamberlain altered the strategic balance of the entire continent. However, victory also had a personal cost. Envious courtiers began to whisper. Chamberlain was too successful, too popular, too dangerous. A general winning impossible battles might suddenly desire the presidential throne. Lincoln heard these whispers. He trusted Chamberlain, but presidential trust was always conditional. For now, Chamberlain enjoyed his well-deserved fame. A 25-year-old colonel, who turned the earth into a weapon, defeated 40,000 soldiers with an army of 25,000, proving that the Union still produced military geniuses. The Plains of Desolation remained marked by the scars of battle for decades. The trenches slowly filled with earth. Confederate bones bleached under the sun. Local nomads for generations found swords and armor. The battlefield became a place of pilgrimage for soldiers who wished to see where a miracle had occurred. The man who never lost a battle in the open field repeatedly lost in the corridors of power. 3 years after desolation, in 1866, Lincoln sent Chamberlain to Florida. Mission: destroy the secessionist forces and reclaim the southern states lost a century earlier. Chamberlain landed with 15,000 soldiers against a confederation numbering 80,000. Lincoln's advisors predicted disaster, but they were wrong. Chamberlain applied the lessons of desolation. He studied the terrain, identified the enemy's weaknesses, and utilized superior mobility. At the Battle of the Cypress Swamp, he shattered the main Confederate army. 3 months later, in 1868, Lincoln ordered the reconquest of Texas. The Confederacy controlled the territory since its secession. Chamberlain landed in Galveston with 7,500 soldiers to confront a confederation of 150,000. Again, everyone predicted failure. Chamberlain captured Texas in weeks. He crossed into the Confederacy, took New Orleans, and marched towards Richmond. The Confederacy besieged Washington with 30,000 troops. Chamberlain defended the capital with 5,000. For a year, he repelled all attacks, using the fortifications of Washington, just as he had used the trenches at Desolation, turning defense into an offensive weapon. In 1871, Chamberlain captured Richmond, the Confederate capital. The South was conquered. In 10 years, Chamberlain destroyed 2 confederations and reclaimed half of the old United States. His victories rivaled those of George Washington, but military glory did not protect him from political betrayal. In Washington, Chamberlain's enemies multiplied: envious generals, jealous senators, courtiers fearing his growing power, whispered to the president, "Chamberlain is too popular with the troops, too rich from war spoils, too ambitious. He could declare himself president with a single word." Lincoln listened and began to doubt. He withdrew troops from Chamberlain at critical moments, sent other generals to share command, undermining his authority. In 1872, when the Confederacy violated the perpetual peace and invaded again, Lincoln sent Chamberlain to the east with insufficient forces. Imperial trust had evaporated. Chamberlain fought under unbearable conditions, without sufficient troops, without gold, without political support. He still stopped the Confederate advance. He could not achieve a decisive victory like Desolation due to lack of resources, but he prevented a complete collapse. It was barely enough. In 1873, the nation was struck by the Spanish flu, which claimed a third of the population. Chamberlain was recalled to defend the capital from conspirators planning a coup. While the president was weak, Chamberlain once again saved Lincoln's throne. He suppressed the conspiracy and executed its leaders. In 1878, Chamberlain faced accusations of treason, fabricated conspiracy, false evidence, bought testimonies. Lincoln believed it, or pretended to believe it. Chamberlain was arrested, his property confiscated, his rank stripped. The general who saved the nation was declared a criminal. 6 months later, Lincoln granted him a pardon, reinstated his rank, and returned his property. But the damage was done. Chamberlain understood the truth. Loyalty to the president did not guarantee reciprocal loyalty. Intrigues at court proved far more dangerous than any battlefield. In 1883, Chamberlain had his last chance to shine. Hungarian raiders, representing nomadic tribes, were invading the north, advancing towards the capital. Panic gripped the city. Lincoln had no available army. All troops were in Texas, Florida, and the West. The city was defenseless. Chamberlain, then 54 years old, volunteered. He gathered the city militia, farmers, old men, veterans, and 300 real soldiers, a total of about 2,000 men against 7,000 raiders. Chamberlain once again resorted to the tactics of desolation. He chose advantageous terrain, set up ambushes, utilized mobility. Thus, he defeated the raiders with significantly smaller forces and saved the capital. Lincoln rewarded him with only empty words and nothing more. In the end, Chamberlain retired. He spent his final years in relative solitude, dying in 1903, the same year as Lincoln. Some later chronicles claim that Lincoln blinded him, leaving him a beggar. This is a false legend, but it lives on because it seems true. An invincible commander, betrayed by the president he saved. The truth is less dramatic, but sadder. Chamberlain died in his bed, a wealthy and respected man, but embittered, realizing that his military victories had not brought him political security, and that he had saved a nation that viewed him with suspicion. The Battle of Desolation remains his masterpiece, a moment when pure genius overcame unimaginable odds. His legacy extends beyond life and death. For military history, Desolation was a turning point. It demonstrated that terrain preparation could compensate for enemy numerical superiority, that intelligently applied engineering was worth 1,000 soldiers, and that a commander's mind was the deadliest weapon. Later Union strategists studied desolation with religious fervor. General Sherman, 30 years later, wrote a military manual, including an entire section on field fortifications, based on Chamberlain's techniques. Union generals replicated elements of desolation, but never achieved the same success, because Chamberlain possessed something that could not be taught: intuitive genius in reading battles. But the principles remained. Prepare the field. Channel the enemy. Turn their strengths into weaknesses. In medieval Europe, the concept of field fortifications became standard. Crusaders dug trenches before battles. English armies in the 100 Years' War used stakes to stop French cavalry. They did not reference Chamberlain and likely never heard of the Battle of Desolation, but the principles seeped through the centuries. World War I, a direct descendant of desolation. Industrial trenches, barbed wire instead of wooden stakes, artillery instead of riflemen. But the concept is identical, turning the land into a weapon, forcing the enemy to attack prepared positions. Chamberlain would have instantly recognized the psalm. The lessons of desolation extend beyond military matters. They are lessons on how to confront impossible odds with limited resources, lessons applicable to any human problem. First, preparation conquers improvisation. Chamberlain had 4 days to prepare the field. He used every second when the Confederates arrived. Meticulous preparation turned a disadvantage into an advantage. Second, creativity surpasses strength. Chamberlain did not have more soldiers than the Confederates. He did not have better equipment. He had a mind that saw solutions where others saw inevitable defeat. He refused to fight as the enemy expected. He created an entirely new battle. Third, understanding the enemy's assumptions. This is a strategic advantage. The Confederates assumed open terrain favored their cavalry. They assumed trenches were a Union weakness. Chamberlain turned every Confederate assumption into a deadly trap. He knew Beauregard's thoughts better than Beauregard himself. He convinced 25,000 skeptical men to execute a plan that seemed insane. He made them believe. He made them work. He made them win. Fifth, victory has its price. 5,000 Union soldiers died at Desolation. 5,000 families lost fathers, sons, brothers. Victory was necessary. It was brilliant. It was costly. Chamberlain never forgot the dead. He carried their names to his last breath. Desolation also teaches a lesson about the limits of military genius. Chamberlain won every battle, but lost the political war. This proves that a different arena requires a different genius. The man who manipulated armies like chess pieces could not manipulate the courtiers of Washington. Today, 150 years later, the Plains of Desolation are barren. Occasional tourists visit the ruins of the old town. Few know what an epic battle took place there. The trenches disappeared centuries ago. Confederate bones crumbled to dust. but the echo remains. It remains every time a commander studies the terrain before battle. It remains every time an engineer designs a defense, using geometry and physics. It manifests every time someone refuses to surrender in the face of crushing superiority. Chamberlain showed that 25,000 could overcome 40,000, that youth surpasses experience, that careful preparation conquers numbers, that the human mind is the most powerful weapon ever created. It was not the trenches of desolation that killed the Confederates, but Chamberlain's cunning. The trenches were merely one tool. The true weapon was genius. If you have read this story to the end, you have already mastered the basic lesson. You face your own battles, perhaps not with swords and horses, but with battles where the odds are against you, where resources are limited, where all points towards failure. Remember desolation. Prepare your territory. Use your mind. Turn disadvantages into advantages. Do not fight the battle as the enemy expects. Create a battle in which only you can win. Chamberlain turned the very earth into a weapon and changed the course of history. Now, don't forget to leave your comment. Feigned retreat. Cavalry position. If this story of military genius captivated you, subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications. Dozens of other incredible battles await their telling. Generals who, with their brilliant decisions, changed the course of history. Strategies that defied all logic. The next chapter will transport you to another battlefield, where the impossible became inevitable. Until then, remember, true victory is not in numbers. It lies in preparation, in strategy, in the intellect that turns obstacles into means of achieving goals.